the other side of this tension is how do we also take workload off frontline GPs and nurses so they can focus on the people that are in front of them, not having to deal with this backlog of administrative work that they all have to deal with every day, and by moving that into a team that can kind of process that more efficiently.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Today, real privilege to be sitting down having a chat with Josh Robb. Welcome along, Josh. How are you?
Hey, Paul. Great to meet you and be here.
Yeah, likewise. Maybe you can fill folks in where you fit into this big wide world of tech and startups here in New Zealand.
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-founders and the Chief Product and Technology Officer for Tend Health. And so we are a healthcare service provider. So we're a technology business and a healthcare service business in one, which is a really exciting and interesting thing to try and do. It's kind of like trying to mix oil and water some days, but we're trying to imagine a whole new way of delivering healthcare services, both for consumers, but also for the primary care workforce. So for GPs and nurses and the other people that work in primary care. You will have seen lots of media over the last 12 months about problems in healthcare, and particularly in primary care, and how unsustainable it is, burnout, workload. There's all sorts of challenges on the workforce side. And at the same time, there's real issues with equity in New Zealand in terms of the kind of access to services in different parts of the country, what kind of experience people have and whatever else. So we're trying to kind of come up with a new model for how we deliver that really provides an improvement from a consumer perspective, but also really provides a much better and more sustainable job for the people that are actually working in those services and delivering those services on a daily basis, because I think there's been a real lack of meaningful change in that space in a long time.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like a really good opportunity. So it's exciting to see you and the Tend team taking it on.
Yeah.
So definitely looking forward to delving into that. But I thought maybe to start with, we can hear a little bit about sort of your journey in the sort of software development and startup world. You came from PushPay sort of prior to Tend, but there's a bit more back from there. So what was it that sort of initially drew you into the world of tech?
Well, I think at the start of my career, I worked for Fujitsu, doing kind of consulting and services stuff, and really had a great team. Really enjoyed what I was doing. Technically, really interesting. But what I realized quite quickly is that if I was doing that kind of work, I was always going to be in the cost center side of a business, and I quickly understood that I wanted to not be on the cost center side of things. I wanted to actually be on the value creation side of things. And so I kind of made a switch. I'd been programming since I was young, 12, 13 or something, but I kind of was like, I should move into software engineering, because if you build products that help run businesses, then that's more value than just making networks and systems work well for a business. And so I went and worked for Glazier Systems, which quickly became Advantage Group and then became eventually Intergen. Worked with a bunch of really smart people there, like Tony Stewart and Rod Drury, and a whole bunch of really smart people. And a few people at that point in time were really evangelizing the idea of software as a service. Salesforce had been out for a few years at that point in time, and the idea that you could deploy something with a web browser as opposed to having to run around with binaries and storing them on individual computers was kind of transformational. And I was like, this is much more interesting. And so I kind of got excited about software product development from that experience, and that's kind of what I've done. And I think only recently have I kind of looked back on my career and realized that pretty much since that point, which was around 2000, 2001, I've consistently chosen to go and work for crazy entrepreneurs over and over again. And even though some days I'm like, why do I do this to myself? I've kept on making that choice, so I must enjoy it. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep on choosing it. And I do. I really, really do. So I love my friend JD Trask, who's the CEO of Raygun, made this comment. He's a bit like me. He grew up quite nerdy and into computers at a time when that was definitely not trendy. And he said, I was never into sports at high school, but when I realized that business was like the best team sport ever, then it suddenly clicked for me. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. It's like I really, really enjoy the camaraderie of doing something with a group of people, building something together, trying to grow, dealing with the kind of highs and lows of that on a daily basis is really good fun. And I've worked pretty much consistently for startups since that point in time in different kind of shapes and stages, but always kind of choosing to kind of be in a business that's building something new as opposed to businesses that are kind of running something that already exists. And there's no disrespect to people that do that. It's a hard job. But I really enjoy the growth and the building So that's been the choice. I've kind of done a whole bunch of stuff over the 20 years intervening, but that's been my kind of consistent pattern of decision making.
Yep.
Maybe not fully conscious, but yeah.
So in those early days, sort of moving into the software world, what did you do?
I worked for lots of failed startups. My wife and I moved to Italy, and we lived there for a year and a half or so, which was a great experience. Not much of a startup scene in Italy at that point in time. It's changed a bit since. And then moved to London and worked for a couple of startups there. Some really interesting kind of ideas, None of them made very much money. In most cases, I ended up having to get new jobs because they didn't make money, which was disappointing because you spend a lot of time building software and really sweating the details and thinking about how to make things work well and how to make things work great for users and to look beautiful and to be architecturally elegant and to be safe and secure. And there's lots of things to do building software. And then to kind of get to go home and just throw that away and start again is kind of, disheartening for the team and disheartening for the individual. I mean, apart from the business failure side of it, which is obviously got its own kind of dynamics, but to have kind of spent this time crafting something and then for it to come to nothing, a few different times was kind of very, not painful, but just it kind of really forced me to start thinking about, okay, if, I've only got so many rolls of the dice in my career, how do I make sure that the things that I'm working on, I think, are sustainable ideas that can actually turn into something that is meaningful and valuable over time? Was a kind of a real interesting learning experience for me. I'd say that was kind of the noughties for me, was kind of going, okay, how do we make sure we build software that's good? And so by the end of the noughties, I ended up working for this interesting organisation. They've actually rebranded again. I actually can't remember the current name, but they were TMP Worldwide, and they do recruitment advertising. So they're an agency that their whole business is helping employers recruit people, and they have some very big clients like BP and Tesco in the UK and all sorts of stuff internationally. But we ended up doing a startup within that business, which was really interesting. So we built an applicant tracking system, which is a job application system that you use for managing. We ended up selling it to sort of 15 or 20 of the FTSE 50. It was a great little business. The company that I was actually working for was acquired by TMP, and TMP acquired it because of the relationships they had with those customers. And we'd built a really nice little recurring revenue software as a service business inside this agency. It was doing 7 figures in pounds, which was great. And a small team working on it, really proud of what we built. And the acquirer came in and were like, yep, we love your relationships with these businesses. We have a competing product that's a little bit different, but sells for probably 10x what that one does.
Wow.
We want to sunset your product and sell them this one instead. And I was like, you cannot fault the strategy there. It was a great business decision. It was painful to have to sunset a product and to kind of work with these customers we've been working with for kind of 5 or 6 years to kind of be, hey, look, we're turning this off. How can we support you migrating to something else? By the way, we've got something else. Really tough on the team. People invest in the things they build. But a really great experience and really interesting experience to go through. I learned lots about how not to write SaaS contracts out of that, actually, and the importance of having good termination provisions, because it turned out we actually didn't have a legal right to terminate some of our customers, which was interesting. But really interesting experience and really, really fun, really great team. And then coming out of that, I'd worked in the UK, and then my wife and I had lived in Melbourne for a couple of years, and then had a kid and moved back to Auckland to be close to family. And I kind of kept working with them and running the team kind of through that whole experience. But I kind of found myself in 2013 contracting in Auckland for a little bit, which was great. But it was the first time I'd worked in New Zealand in about 13 or 14 years. And looking for what to do next. And I'd been carpooling with this guy, Phil Howie, who was the founding engineer at Pushpay since 2011 or something. I'd known him. He'd come to me and said, I've got these friends and they want to build this app you can use to pay for things. What do you think? And I was like, well, this seems like a bad idea. Whatever you do, don't take it. It's probably the worst business advice I've ever given anyone in my life. But I was like, make sure you get paid for that, because it seems unlikely it's going to turn into anything.
I guess you'd been part of things.
Well, I've been in a lot of failed startups, and I know a lot of people that have worked in failed startups. So And to be fair, like the initial idea for Pushpay was very, very broad. Chris had this really, really wide ambition to be like a horizontal payment brand like Visa or MasterCard. And they experimented with all sorts of things. I mean, full credit to the team at that point in time. They tried, paying for coffees and paying for builders and plumbers and paying for
Electricity.
Yeah, electricity. I mean, I worked on that, but they were like talking about doing a deal to pay for toll roads. I mean, there was clearly at that point in time a real payments problem. It was inconvenient to pay for a lot of things, and mobile payments at that point in time were not very prevalent. I mean, it was obvious that Apple and Google were going to come for that market. And I think that's one of the things I actually learned that's really interesting is it's very, very hard to know from the outside whether or not a business is going to be successful because everything is so dependent on the actual strategy of the business and the need that they're filling within a segment. And so it's easy to look at the outside, like at Pushpay, people used to say to me, well, how do you have so many developers? At the time, the team was like 100 people. And it's like, seems like a lot of people for what looks from a consumer experience perspective, like a couple of web pages that let you pay for things. And maybe an app. But unless you understand the value that the business is providing to the people that actually pay it, it's very hard to assess whether or not it's going to be successful. And I think that's kind of part of my journey has been kind of getting my head into what's the actual underlying business model, like where are the actual gaps in the market, what are the customer needs, and where is the value and what are people willing to pay for? And I think if you can find a problem that's big enough that people are willing to pay for, then you can have a great business no matter how much it looks like something else if you're solving real people's problem and they're giving you real money for it. So, yeah.
And so what was it that sort of, pulled you in to actually join Pushpay?
Well, I'd worked for another startup that had run out of money. And so at the end of 2013, they'd run out of money. And so I kind of found myself unexpectedly on the job market just before Christmas. And Pushpay had actually run out of money as well. And because I knew Phil quite well, I knew some other people in there too. They'd had this big staff meeting, and full credit to Chris and Elliot. They had the staff meeting and they'd said, look, everyone's just been paid. We need you to know that's it. There's no more money in the bank for next month's payroll. So we would like you to make sure that you act in your own interest and look after yourselves and your families. And we want to be fully honest with you about this, which I really respect. Like that's a hard meeting to have with the team.
Yeah. I remember we discussed that when I chatted with Chris Heslop on NZ Business Podcast, and we sort of talked through that journey. And really interesting just to hear that story from his perspective, because they did have a couple of options,
Sure, they did. But at that point in time, they also had no money in the bank. And so I actually, like Chris knew that I was on the market, he found out. And so he'd contacted me through the CTO at Pushpay at the time. And I came and had a meeting with him and Paul Shingles, who was the COO there. And they were like, we'd love you to come and work with us. The team was like 2 or 3 people. And I was like, well, haven't you just run out of money? And they're like, yeah, but we think we're going to get some more. And I was like, okay. So it was like early December, and I was like, well, I'll just have summer off. I'll do Christmas with the family. And in January, if you've got money, I'll come and work for you. And if you don't, I had a job offer from Spark, and I could go do some software development there. And I was like, well, okay, I've got something. So they managed to raise some more money. Peter Hewlett came and invested at that point in time, and they really took off. And one of the things I'd been talking with Phil earlier about in the Pushpay journey was that they were kind of randomly trying all these different kind of options to try and find product market fit, which is a great way to do it. But I was like, Phil, what Pushpay really needs is someone who's going to be in the room and ask the question, how is this going to make us money? Because there's lots of payment problems, but there are not lots of payment problems that will generate sustainable revenue. And solving payment problems, if you're not clear on how that's actually going to turn into a revenue stream for you, seems like a bad business strategy. And they'd hired this guy, Paul Shingles. It's an interesting story, actually, but Paul was the guy in the room saying, how is this going to make us money? And they'd hired him about 6 months earlier. And between him and the Hewlett family, they'd kind of suddenly focused on, this church market really have a payment problem, and they're willing to pay for a solution to it. And which is an important, having a good problem is really important, but having customers that are willing to pay for a solution to that problem is as important as having a good problem. So Paul had kind of, and the rest of the leadership team in the Hewlett had kind of helped focus the business on, okay, let's really go hard after this church market in the States. And they'd raised this money to scale into the US. So pretty much at the time that I was joining, Chris and Elliot were moving to the US. They'd already been there for a bit, kind of temporarily, but they were fully committed. What's the saying? Committed like a pig, not committed like a chicken. So they relocated their families. So I came in and quite quickly ended up running the engineering team there by about the middle of 2014 and growing that team from 4 to, it was very rapid growth. I think we added 25 people in the first year and then kind of tripled and then doubled and doubled. So it was 100 people within kind of 2 years. So that's a very hard thing to do. Both just recruiting that many people is complex from a kind of cultural and workforce availability perspective, but also kind of maintaining forward momentum on key initiatives and projects. The business was growing very, very, very quickly. So I think when I started, we probably had maybe like $50,000 of recurring revenue per annum. at the end of the first year, actually must have been less than that. At the end of 2014, we probably had $200,000 of recurring revenue, and the year after that, we had millions. It was ridiculous. We were adding hundreds and hundreds of customers a month by kind of early 2015, and so there were all sorts of interesting problems to kind of solve, and scaling challenges and quality challenges and whatever else. But it was a great experience, and had a really good time.
Yeah. So tell me about that that scaling and that growth. Like, had you needed to hire at that sort of pace
No.
before? Like, what did you put into play to make that work? Was it sort of extra roles that were able to carry that a lot? What were the kind of the challenges and the solutions to to make that work out well?
That's a great question. I think there's kind of quite a few different layers to it, but one of the things that was really nice is that kind of Chris and Elliot had a really clear kind of vision of what they wanted to make from a product perspective. They weren't always fully aligned, but they had quite a clear idea of the kind of general category problems they wanted to solve. And they managed to build, and I think full credit to them, they really understood that the most important thing is not actually the technology or the product, it's having customers that are willing to pay you for a problem. I've already said this, but that's the real key test.
Yeah.
And so they sold quite a long way ahead of where the product was. They kind of sold the vision as opposed to what they had. And there were early adopters that were willing to say, yep, look, we can see that this is very thin at the moment, but we also love what you're saying and where you're going. And their vision was absolutely spot on. If you look at what happened in that charitable giving space in the US, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, before PushPay, that was mostly checks and people putting cash in buckets, and that clearly was not going to be sustainable at that point in time. Someone needed to bring a solution to that problem because people are carrying less and less cash. I don't have any cash on me today. I don't know if you do, but I had to go to something yesterday. My wife was like, "Have you got any money?" I was like, "No, I don't have any money." So they sold the vision, and then as soon as you have customers, then you start getting feedback, right? So there are all these people saying, "Well, where's this thing that I need to be able to do my job? Or I have this problem, and I'm using your product, and I can't solve this problem myself. Like, how is this problem going to get solved?" So we had like very clear feedback from the early customers and from the sales team about what we needed to build to win more business and to keep the business that we had. It was not ambiguous. Like, they were all aligned on like 3 or 4 really key things.
Right. Yeah.
And those things were not trivial. They were quite significant initiatives, but it was really obvious what needed to be built. And so the whole team, it was really easy to align the team because it was like, everyone's telling us we need these 3 things. So we need to go really hard after these 3 things. And at the same time, we need to hire a team of people that can let us do these things faster and with higher quality and whatever else. So it was really a matter of kind of going, okay, we know how the work we've got to do, like at least at a high level, we know what customers are demanding, and that's a great place to be. Like, if you've got a product and your customers aren't telling you they want more stuff, then that's in itself a feedback, right? So we had this really clear kind of backlog of work or roadmap of things we needed to achieve, and it was like, well, how are we going to get all this done? It's like, with the team at the time, it was maybe half a dozen people. It was like, okay, this is going to take 6 years. And so the pressure from the executive team and from the board was like, okay, how can we do it in 12 months or 18 months or 2 years? And I think one thing about PushPay that, was really kind of early in the DNA there was setting really ambitious goals. So being ambitious in terms of, how many new sales we wanted to get, being ambitious in terms of how long we wanted to take before we were willing to release something. The thing with PushPay is it's payments, and so it's both regulated, quite highly regulated in terms of the credit card side of things. And the PushPay also does a lot of transactions in the US banking system in terms of the equivalent of bank payments. It's worked quite differently over there, but that's also regulated in its own way. So there's all sorts of hoops and hurdles to jump through there. So going fast is hard. The standard that we set for the kind of customer experience and the quality of that experience is really high. And also because you're handling money on behalf of some other organization, and especially because it's charitable, like that trust relationship is a really big deal. A charity or a church saying, hey, we trust you to receive donations on our behalf for our people that are donating to us. It's kind of it's a significant choice for them.
You can't stuff, you can't stuff that up, otherwise they're stuck.
And this exactly, and they lose the trust. Like, they lose the trust of their givers, and then they don't have the money to fund their services.
Accidentally double charge someone, or any of those sort of scenarios that we've all seen, and everything goes.
And we had some horrific experiences. Right? Some of them. Our fault in terms of, we made mistakes in terms of the quality of what we'd built or operational processes or whatever else. But also, like, the banking system's actually kind of constantly broken to some extent.
Especially in the US.
Well, I mean, everywhere, like the fact that credit card payments work at all is actually kind of a miracle, really. It's incredible what actually has to happen to make that all work. And so, I mean, we had situations where, 2 or 3 occasions where processors in the States or banks or bank networks in the States would load yesterday's tape again by accident and replay transactions on our behalf. Yeah. That would affect hundreds of thousands of people. They would at least put holds on the money again.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden you've got someone who gave $200 yesterday, having another $200 come out of their account today.
They might not have room to
they don't, or they
else.
can't buy food, or they can't pay their rent, and there's no mechanism in the payment system to reverse that. You've just got to wait for that hold to expire. So how do you manage the response management around that, the incident response management, customer communications, managing stakeholders in terms of, boards and everything else? It was a very exciting and difficult and painful experience.
It does sound pretty painful and stressful having to deal with those sorts of things. So how do you get through those sort of challenges and end up on the better side?
So I think I stole liberally from lots of other people. And so I think in particular, in 2014, 2015, Etsy, the sort of online craft marketplace, had been through a really difficult scaling period of their own from sort of 2010 that had all sorts of interesting things. And they talked quite publicly about some of the issues they'd had and some of the practices and cultures and things they'd focused on. And one thing that I'd kind of been interested in for quite a while, I'd worked with a startup in the 2000s who had not been successful, but the guy that ran it was really, really interesting guy. He was into all sorts of alternative religions and all sorts of things. And he'd introduced me to Nonviolent Communication, which is a book by this guy whose name just is temporarily escaping me, who had spent his whole life trying to facilitate dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians.
Oh, wow.
And so he has a framework for how to express feelings, strong feelings and needs and whatever else in a way that is kind of clear and unambiguous, but also non-violent. That was my first introduction to the kind of overall notion of just culture and the idea that there was kind of 2 ways to kind of deal with conflict in life. So on the one hand, you have sort of a punitive culture where, mistakes get punished. If you say something bad or do something bad, the wrath comes down, and it's how most companies tend to organize themselves. You have a target or a deliverable, and if you don't meet it, then you get beaten by whoever the person is responsible until you do the thing.
Yep.
Or you can have a culture where it's restorative, where you say, hey, look, how do we learn from this experience? How do we hold people accountable, but also work to improve the systems and processes? And what Etsy had discovered, their CTO at the time, John Allspore, VP of Engineering, had encountered what's called human factors research, which is study into incidents or human errors. And so kind of things they typically research are things like air traffic control, plane or vehicle accidents or ship accidents, but also medical misadventure and surgery. There's a whole bunch of research in there. And in that world, there's been a lot of work done looking at the kind of root causes of system errors. And if you see like a plane crash, quite often it's like pilot error is the sort of prescribed reason. But in fact, pilots are operating within a system. It's a very complex system. I don't just mean the system of plane controls. There's air traffic controls and all the feedback they're getting from different things. Same with surgeons and hospitals or other kind of hospital monitoring systems where it's not just an individual's error of judgment in the moment that causes this. There's a whole sequence of events that gets there. And so some software engineers have kind of taken some of these concepts and turned them into this idea of kind of just culture, or sometimes it's called blameless culture, which is the idea that running internet services is not dissimilar to flying an airplane or to maybe doing surgery. I mean, maybe that's a little bit grandiose, but certainly it's very similar in that they're complex systems. There's many different people involved. There's different factors. There's different agents and actors. And if you punish people for mistakes, you end up not being able to learn from things when they go wrong and figure out how to improve the system to make it safer in the future. Yeah. And I'd kind of been exposed to this kind of over intervening 10 years or so. And so by the time I got to PushPay, one of the first things that happened really early on is that we did a release like in the first month or so of me being there, and it went really badly wrong. And so I was like, okay, well, we're going to stop and we're going to reflect as a group on this experience. We're going to write down some notes about what happened and why, and actions that we think we can take that could improve this outcome next time. And so we started establishing that kind of learning culture and that sort of blameless culture really, really early at PushPay. And it made it really easy because one of the things that I started saying to people was, I was like, look, it's not fair to recruit people to come and work on a payment system. It's notoriously scary to work on payments. People don't like it normally. It's high consequence for getting things wrong. And so we can't ask people to come in and work on things and then beat them when things go wrong. We have to have a process where we say, okay, how do we make this better and safer next time? How are we able to go fast, but also able to go fast in a way that the individual is not going to end up being hung out to dry when something goes wrong?
Yeah.
And so we established that really early, and I think that was probably one of the key sort of factors, and there's a whole bunch of path dependence that's very hard to kind of necessarily know exactly, but certainly that's a ethos or a kaupapa that's still really alive today at Pushpay, and it's really cool to see it. And they talk about it across the whole business, not just the engineering part of it, but like the HR team talk about it. And it does not mean there's not accountability. It just means that when something goes wrong, we don't start with, Paul, you made a mistake. We're going to take you out the back and give you a beating until you don't make any more mistakes, because that's just not an effective thing. But it's like, hey, Paul, you said you're going to do X and you didn't do X. That is not. Like, we can still have an accountability conversation with you about whether or not you've delivered on what you said you were going to do. It's when things go wrong, how do we as an organisation learn from those mistakes and improve on our organisational systems and processes to do that? And I think really creating a learning culture was really, really important really early. It's really important to create that psychological safety. It's become very popular since. It wasn't a phrase that we used at the time, but it was absolutely trying to create psychological safety in the face of a really scary environment where we had a really, really rudimentary system that was almost a prototype, to be honest, that was being sold very rapidly to a lot of organisations. And so we had to have a way to kind of go, how are we going to evolve this really quickly, improve its safety, improve its reliability, improve its performance, but not have individuals feeling like they're going to get, castigated for things going wrong.
Yeah, you've only had so much time to develop what's there. There's all sorts of limitations, pressures, etc., and you've got to create that right sort of culture. And I guess, in the startup world, which is starting to, aspects of startup life as just the norm, I guess, within more and more businesses, right? That need to be able to move at pace and iterate and come out with new things and so on, right? It's I think it's essential for the survival of a lot of organisations that they actually take on these sort of startup type sort of tenants, right? And so that sounds like you got that really, really right really early on, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, like, I don't think I'm a genius about this. I think it was just the right obvious thing to do, and a bit of luck in terms of what I'd been exposed to. And I wasn't the only person in the organisation that was aware of this. It was a movement that was building within the tech sector, and it's much more widely kind of appreciated and known now than it was then. But it was one of those really critical enablers for us culturally that allowed us to kind of safely hire people and onboard them and ramp them up. The other thing that happened just really quickly is that we had a production issue. I was still quite hands-on at this point in time at Pushpay. We had a production issue kind of late 2014, and I ended up having to do some database work one night quite late for an operational need. And again, like it's a classic scenario, a whole system of fail-safes and whatever failed, and I ended up accidentally sanitizing, removing a whole bunch of data out of the production database at about 11 o'clock at night.
How did that make you feel?
Oh, it was not a good night. I mean, it was a dark place. It was really not good. Even worse, one of our key investors was in the middle of demoing to Amex in Australia when this happened. So they were the one that found the problem. It wasn't obvious in the moment that what had gone wrong. So I got a call like 30 minutes later saying, hey, is there something wrong? And I was like, oh. And sure enough, there was. So, spent a lot of time recovering data, and the team had to do a whole bunch of work over the next few weeks to kind of fix things up. So we got things sorted out relatively quickly. But it was a really liminal moment for the organisation because I came in the next morning, everyone knew what had happened. And it was a really important test culturally for the business of, is this blameless culture, is it truly blameless, or is Josh getting fired? And to be honest, I didn't know what was going to happen. But full credit to Chris and Elliot and Paul Shingles at the time, the COO. I mean, obviously it was not a good incident, and we were able to talk about the consequences of this and the impact to this investor and our brand and, whatever else. So as to say, we did not raise money from Amex at that point in time. Not that I actually know that was what was going to happen, but it was also really important to go, okay, yes, this went badly wrong. And we just did the same process. It was like, okay, what are we going to learn from this? How are we going to change things? What are we going to do differently next time? And we established a whole bunch of different ways of working at that point in time. And one of the big ones was actually we're at a size and a scale now where it's not suitable for one person to be working in production at 11 o'clock at night because they're on a deadline. Like that's actually not a safe practice. And so we're like, actually, we need like the kind of the startup hero, do an all-nighter to kind of get something done. It's like actually this acting against ourselves in this moment. We need to be more intentional about making sure we're putting people in a safe situation where they're well rested, and when they're doing highly risky things, they've got the appropriate support around them, so they're not just off soloing it by themselves. So we kind of made quite a few changes around that, and some of those things I still carry with me now in terms of how we get people to work on production systems when we're doing high risk stuff, because you can put it the wrong command in the wrong window and have very serious consequences, not just for yourself, but for many, many thousands of millions of other people.
Yeah, and I think that there's a really good lesson, some learning in there, and I hope for listeners that they're catching this, because there is this sort of pace that comes, and you can end up with the sort of heroes that end up working long hours and so on. But we've got to recognise that actually that stuff's not sustainable, and we might sometimes think that this is the way it has to be, this is startup life and so on, and actually there can be flow-ons in terms of an impact into the business. There can be flow-ons in terms of the impact on families and so on, whether it's with the long hours, traveling and so on, and it's actually really important to figure those things out and to recognise how you're going to navigate through what sometimes are some pretty intense pressures, right?
Absolutely.
Like I can imagine you've got Amex opportunity, and I'm not saying this was the case here, but where it was like, we need to deliver this by this time because you've got this is the deadline.
Yeah. It was unrelated,
we
but
have to do it, right?
There was a different deadline.
These things can happen.
Absolutely.
Right? And you've got to work out when you say yes and when you say no to,
and I just think,
to
like,
those
also
pressures.
I've learned a lot. My brother was kind of early very into kind of outdoor extreme kind of adventure stuff. He did a whole bunch of different things, ice climbing and mountaineering and whitewater kayaking and stuff. And he's an incredibly good risk manager. And one of the things that you kind of learn if you study kind of the history of misadventure and kind of outdoor stuff, if you look at incidents where people have been harmed or been in unsafe situations, often it's because people are fatigued, they're tired, and the decision-making kind of gets progressively worse. And so you end up with a series of decisions that have been made from people that are under stress and they're fatigued. And then the next thing you know, you've got a boat that's, in an unsafe situation, or you've got someone stuck up a mountain without the right equipment or without the right supporting team around them or whatever else. And I think, for building software products, services that run online, particularly if they're used by a lot of people or they run 24/7, or, that working with those systems is really similar to anything else. There are decisions that you will make that are really high-risk decisions, and how do you provide a culture and a set of management mechanisms that mean that people aren't making dangerous decisions by themselves when they're unprepared for them and they have the right support around them and they're not fatigued. And so kind of learning things like later on at Pushpay, we started moving into kind of much more structured incident management where things were going underway. We would rotate people through incident management roles every kind of 4 to 8 hours so that no one was running an incident for too long before the pressure kind of ends up kind of compounding into, and all of the big mistakes that I've seen have ended up happening. They tend to be after hours, they tend to be late in the day, people working to deadlines, and then the remediation and response to that gets very complicated because people aren't available, it's the weekend, I've been in so many war rooms over the years where people are dealing with major problems and everyone's tired and stressed and frustrated, and people get elevated, and it's difficult to kind of manage people's emotions through that, and also to make sure you're making really high quality decisions. And so how do you kind of create a culture where you're not running people so hot that you don't have the capacity to deal with the unplanned or the unexpected? I think in startups that's kind of a really important question.
Yeah, it's such a challenge, and we talked before the show around what Twitter's going through, and they're going through huge changes, and there's an aspect there where they've reset in many ways, sort of back to, they've got an existing product, but they've reset back to, we need to, whatever Musk has decided and the team have decided that they need to do, and it seems to be, a big up in sort of pace and intensity and so on. It's going to be quite fascinating to see how that plays out.
It really will.
Over time. Anything else you wanted to sort of share from that time at Pushpay? Because I'm definitely keen to learn about Tend.
Yeah. I mean, it's a phenomenal business and a phenomenal product, and I'm really proud of the work that we did there. There's a whole amazing group of alumni that have gone on to do other things, and that's one of the greatest things actually. I think there's been a whole bunch of exits over the last couple of years in different ways, and it's just really nice to see the ecosystem in New Zealand growing in terms of its capability and experience. And so I think that's kind of one of the things that I'm most proud of is between Pushpay and Vend and Timely and a whole bunch of others, there's all of these kind of people that are now seasoned operators that are kind of coming out and doing their own things, or working in other startups doing stuff. And it's just nice to see New Zealand's overall capability growing in that space, because I think New Zealand's always had quite high quality software developers in terms of people that can build software. But there's a difference between building software and building a product. And especially online products, software as a service or whatever you want to kind of, what nomenclature you want to choose. It's more important to run the service well than it is to build the product in some ways, because if the service isn't reliable, Twitter's a good example, the fail whale of 10 or 12 years ago.
Went on for years.
It went on for years, right? Yeah. And if products aren't reliable, customers will abandon them. Twitter's a little bit different because it's a consumer product and it was free. So, but if you're selling software to people and it's not reliable, like that's really the end of the game. Like,
yeah, it's quite funny. I actually met the I guess graphic designer, illustrator who designed that fail whale for Twitter one time in the US. And it's quite funny that like something that's such a sign of failure was so well known, and it was like, and that was
must be one of the most famous illustrations in the world, right?
Yeah, at that time anyway. I mean, a lot of people these days wouldn't even probably not even familiar with it, but there was that window of time where the platform was struggling so much that that illustration would come up on a pretty regular basis. So kind of funny.
Yeah.
So Tend, how did Tend come about? What was what did the founding of it look like? How did you
get involved? So while I was at Pushpay, I was doing quite a lot of travel. I was in the US probably every month or every other month for a couple of weeks. So it was kind of 3 or 4 months a year on the road. And I've got 2 kids and a wife. And so my wife and I have been talking and sort of trying to work out what we needed as a family, and this was not working particularly well for us anymore. And around that time, Cecilia and James Robinson approached me and told me they wanted to do something new. They'd been out of my food bag for a couple of years at that point in time, and they'd tried retirement and found it wasn't really for them. They got bored. And
I can imagine.
They were missing some purpose and a sense of kind of mission. And so they made me sign an NDA. And I was not really looking for anything. So I was quite difficult, to be honest. But they convinced me. They were very persuasive. And they were like, look, we want to do something new, but we want you to sign an NDA. So I signed this NDA reluctantly. And they were like, we want to do a health tech startup. And I was like, okay, I'm quite squeamish. Like if there's, medical shows on, I tend to cover my eyes. If there's anything gory or, it's not my thing.
Yep.
And so I'd never really considered this. But I had kind of looked around. And one of the challenges in New Zealand, and we were talking about this before the show, but is that if you build software, it's very difficult to build a software product that's only for the New Zealand market. Trade Me is an outlier example. But there's not very many pieces of software you can build where the market in New Zealand is big enough that you could just sell it in New Zealand and have a sustainable business. And so I had kind of assumed that my next thing was going to need to be offshore, because I was just like, there's just not that many opportunities. And the problem with being in New Zealand is it's great from a lifestyle perspective, but if you have to travel to customers, it's really, really tough.
Yeah.
And, like Rod Drury before Xero, he had a startup called Aftermail. And I remember him talking vividly in like 2006 about the cost of the travel for Aftermail on him and his family at that point in time. And lots of other entrepreneurs that I know have also kind of been through this problem of build a successful business, manage to kind of launch it to the world from New Zealand, which is fantastic. But then you end up on this treadmill of being on planes and, going and doing stuff. And it's been different over the last couple of years with COVID, but I'm already seeing kind of lots of my friends back on planes, back in the US multiple times.
Yeah, it's fun the first few times, right?
Yeah, like travel sounds glamorous until you actually live a travel lifestyle. And then, a friend of mine said to me, it's a great lifestyle for people who are single or who want to be single. And I'm neither of those things. And I think, that's one of the under talked about things with sort of the software world in New Zealand is actually that, COVID's been great because it's cut down some unnecessary travel. And I think people are much more willing to kind of do deals over Zoom or whatever these days. But there is still a need to be in market with your customers, potentially with the rest of your team if you've got a team that's remote.
Yeah.
I know people in the last few weeks that have been in the UK and the US all over the place. So I was trying to work out what I was going to do, and I hadn't really considered health at all. And Cecilia and James were like, look, we think there's this huge opportunity. They'd actually been talking about this idea since before they started My Food Bag. One of the largest healthcare providers in Sweden is a telehealth provider. And so they've been kind of watching that grow since 2011, 2012 and kind of going, this looks really interesting. but they'd gone with the My Food Bag idea and it had gone very, very well for them. So they kind of pitched me this idea and I was like, well, that's really left field. That was not what I expected. And so I went away and started doing some of my own research, not in the QAnon sense, but just trying to understand what was going on, both domestically and internationally. And a few things became really, really clear to me. One was, this had the potential to be a really significantly sized business in New Zealand without doing any travel, which ticked one of my own personal kind of goal boxes. As I got to know Cecilia and James, I really, really started to warm to them. And we just have a really phenomenal relationship now, and it's great. I like entrepreneurial people, as I said. I've consistently chosen to work for crazy entrepreneurs my whole career, and I think they absolutely fit that box. I love it. There are days where you're like, man, why do I do this? But most of the time I love it. And they are phenomenal business leaders and just great people and really values aligned, which is also really important to me. Is it's really important to be working with people that you actually respect and respect their kind of way of thinking about making trade-offs in business, because you have to do that. So I started looking at this and I was like, man, there's so many challenges. The workforce is really burnt out. Customers aren't necessarily, or patients aren't necessarily getting consistent levels of service across the country. I started to understand a little bit about how some of the funding models worked in New Zealand, which is obviously really important. You've got to understand where the money's going to come from to make a business sustainable. And then one of the biggest things was just the kind of lack of digitization of healthcare in this country. When you look internationally, pre-pandemic, this is my numbers from 2019 when I was doing the research, I think 2 out of 5 Americans had a telehealth episode of care in the previous 12 months in 2019. So it's pre-COVID.
40%.
Yeah. Now that's a survey, so, I don't know what the sample accuracy of that was, but, it was it's still significant.
Streets ahead of
certainly
where New Zealand would have been.
And in
at
Northern
the time.
Europe, it's entirely different again. By that point in time, you had Babylon Health operating in the UK, you had Kri in Sweden, Teladoc. There's a whole bunch, Doctor to Go. There was a whole bunch of providers offering kind of different kinds of services and different sort of segments and niches. And when I looked around New Zealand, there was nothing at that point in time that I was aware of. And so I got a real sense of mission, actually, because I was like, man, if New Zealand doesn't effectively produce an Indigenous sort of platform for doing this, or a company that does this, then it's going to end up becoming offshored. At some point in time, it's kind of like Trade Me and eBay, right? Because Trade Me was early in New Zealand, they ended up owning the classified space. And eBay, by the time they got around to looking at New Zealand, it was so well owned, there was no point in them doing a market entry as opposed to Australia. And I think that's been really, really good for New Zealand. It's been great for New Zealand tech in terms of talent and working at scale and whatever else. It's been great, in terms of money that's being reinvested into Xeros. And there's that wonderful flywheel effect that you get. But it's obvious that Apple have been working on a healthcare service for ages. It hasn't launched. There's no time frames that they're working on it. Amazon have been working on one for ages. Google have been working on one since 2002 or 2003. Microsoft have been playing in this space. You've got Babylon, there's a whole bunch. So I was like, sooner or later, some international player is going to go, actually, New Zealand's a nice bite-sized little thing. We'll just come in, we'll launch our solution here. There's a heaps of complexity around this, but what that will mean is that if they win the consumer momentum, all of our health data is going to go offshore, and we're going to become the product of some mega corporate. And I was like, actually,
the control, the profits,
I think that would be a really, really bad
outcome
outcome for New Zealand. So I got really religious about this, to be honest. I was like, actually, New Zealand needs some domestically originated alternatives. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a really difficult situation in 5 or 10 years' time.
Yeah, and look, I think that's actually a key kind of across the board, right? Yeah. We've discussed this on the New Zealand Tech podcast before, like whether it's the Amazons or whoever sort of coming into New Zealand. As much as possible, we want to control our own destiny locally, right? Yep. And look, we're not going to be able to do everything from New Zealand. Look, it's great to have Xero, for instance. It's the other way. It's coming from New Zealand to the rest of the world and so on. But I'm definitely on board with what you're saying, and probably would like to see that in as many areas as possible. So I hope that others that see similar opportunities are taking that mindset on board as well.
There's obviously been a whole discussion around banking over the last couple of weeks, right? Which is another good example of kind of offshoring, the profits and onshoring the sort of downside. So anyway, so that was kind of the genesis. So we started working on this in 2019. I quit my job at PushPay and kind of gave lots of notice and started working full-time for Tend in November 2019. And it's been a really interesting experience since then, trying to work things out. But I think Teresa Gadding, who's our chair and one of our investors, has this great line. She says that in the early 2000s, Spark did this kind of big strategic retreat for the sort of senior team, looking at the impact of the internet on their business and what they thought the opportunities might be and some of the risks. And one of the big opportunities they identified at that point in time was healthcare. And what she likes to say is that, since then, the internet has transformed, dating and banking and all sorts of things, and it really hasn't transformed healthcare, not in a way that is meaningful from a customer perspective. I think if you compare the experience of getting a GP appointment today for most of New Zealand to what it looked like 50 years ago, it would look very, very similar.
Yeah.
You make a phone call, you get given a time, you get in your car, you drive to some place, you wait in a waiting room and you go in. There's some computers, there's electronic medical records, there's not no change. But actually, in terms of the overall experience, it looks very, very similar. And certainly my conviction is that in 10 years' time, I think most episodes of care for healthcare are going to start on your phone and move to the appropriate channel depending on what your needs are. When you look internationally, 60 to 70% of kind of primary care can be done remotely. If you think about your own experience, I don't know how often you see a doctor, but it's quite common to kind of go and see a doctor with some kind of new issue. They'll kind of have a conversation with you, might do an exam, but they might not even need to, because actually a lot of it is really medical history and whatever else. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not trying to trivialise what they do. They'll refer you away for some investigation, a blood test or some other kind of test, and then they'll come back and they go, okay, we've got kind of a diagnosis, here's a treatment plan for this, I'm going to prescribe you some medication or refer you to another service or a specialist or whatever.
Yeah.
Quite a few of those things can be short-circuited, or they don't require you to be there in person. There's stuff that absolutely requires you to be there in person. You can't book a tetanus shot online.
Yeah, and look, there's something to be said for face to face,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep.
And we shouldn't, devalue that and say that it shouldn't happen at all.
No,
But,
absolutely not.
When I certainly think of my sort of experiences with GPs and so on, there's an incredible inefficiency. Some GPs will be like, oh yeah, we can get you an appointment in 3 days' time. Well, that's not very satisfying. Other ones are like, oh yeah, we do walk-in appointments. You just turn up and then you jump in the queue, and then you might have to sit around for 90 minutes or something before you can actually see see a doctor or nurse, whatever is needed. A lot of that just doesn't make sense. And as you say, there's quite often things that shouldn't need an appointment, and they or a face-to-face at least. And then there are variances around things like, oh, I just need another prescription, right?
Yep.
And then so what is that interaction looks like? Well, okay, so it's a 15-minute drive in there, and then it's wait for an hour, and then
how do we streamline some of this stuff?
Seem really, really nuts, and so really, really ripe. So it seems like you got lots there to work with.
There's lots of opportunities, and I think like a lot of there's a lot of really good people in primary care working really hard, including technology vendors building really complex systems that have to do really important things that require really high reliability. Right, it's really important that your blood tests are tagged to you and not some other person. That they've got the right information in them, that they're connected to all the right systems. There's some hard stuff, but they're not really focused on really building out that customer experience. And I think what's happened over the last sort of 10 or 12 years with the introduction of smartphones is that consumers' expectations have moved massively in terms of what their expectations for customer service look like. There was a really good study that Wunderman, the advertising agency, did a few years ago called Wantedness, which was talking about the fact that brands need to demonstrate they want people as customers, and that consumers only really compare their experiences to kind of 5 key brands. This is in America and Europe, but all consumers are effectively, according to Wunderman's study, comparing their kind of customer experience to Apple, Amazon, Netflix, these kind of caliber of experiences in terms of signing up, making a payment, provisioning a service, whatever it is. The bar is very, very high. And when you're dealing with healthcare, a lot of the core services are great. Most doctors, most nurses, are working really, really hard, doing great work for their patients. It's not the service delivery that's the problem. It's all of the supporting experience around that. It's coming in and getting given a clipboard with, 50 questions on it to fill in that you already filled in, 6 months ago somewhere else. Like, how do I bring my information with me? It's like, how do I know the status of my prescription request? Why do I have to call a medical centre and find out what's happened to it? Can't I just see what's happening somewhere? And so it's just kind of bringing a whole bunch of those kind of consumer design ideas to primary care in a way that that works. And I think that's been one of the hardest things for us to work through is we have quite a clear idea of what we want things to do. The question is, how do we make it happen?
Yeah.
And what it led us to quite quickly is we were like, okay, we can't be an online only service because that means there's an entire category of things we can't do.
Yeah.
And it's not safe actually. And in New Zealand, it's also not funded. So it'd have to be private payer kind of thing. And there are some services in New Zealand now that do online only. And that's great. But I think it's very hard to kind of cohesively solve someone's healthcare needs if you can't actually poke and prod them and jab them and do the other things that you might need to do. I'm not a doctor, so I don't even know what's involved there. But but how do we kind of wrap much, much better customer service and much, much better customer communication around that? Because I think there's a lot of work that happens in health that's hidden from you as a patient or a consumer, that it's happening, but you don't know that it's happening. Like, where is my prescription repeat? So last week, for example, we launched a major feature around prescription repeats just because you raised it.
Yeah.
I'll brag about it. But what we did is we just kind of started at this problem from a first principles perspective. So there are some patient portals in the country you can log into a web page and ask for more medication. And as far as I know, I haven't looked at every single one, but I've looked at a lot of them. You make that request and then it disappears into a black hole. And then eventually you get a text or a phone call or something from someone telling you what happened to it, or you can go and pick it up from the pharmacy. So we were like, well, actually, ordering medication is just like ordering something off Amazon. Like, it should be an order, and I should be able to see the status of it, and I should know what's happening and what needs to happen next. So in the Tend app now, when you request medication, we give you the same kind of order tracker, like timeline thing you get with Amazon. So it's like, okay, you've submitted your request, it's sitting there waiting for a review by a clinician. Okay, the clinician's reviewed it, and actually they've sent it to the pharmacy, you can go pick it up. And we've got a nice little thing you can say, okay, I've collected it, that's good. Or the clinicians looked and said, actually, you know what, we really need to see Josh again before we repeat this medication. We're concerned about other drug interactions or something else that's going on, or we need to just take some observations, make sure his blood pressure's okay. We need you to make an appointment. So they've got the ability on our side to say, yep, no, Josh needs an appointment before we can repeat this. And the app will tell you that, gives you a nice push notification. You can go and book an appointment. And soon, we can't quite do this yet, but in the very near future, we'll be able to say, actually, is that an online appointment or an in-person appointment? Or is that a lab test or something else you need to go and do before we just repeat this medication for you? So just really trying to streamline the kind of customer interactions and give you as a consumer more information about what's happening with things that you need out of your healthcare service, which doesn't sound that radical. It turns out to be devilishly hard to do. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us is going, oh, actually, we need to invent a whole new kind of operating model for this, because the current model doesn't really support that kind of communication. It's too small scale. So we've had to start building out some centralized teams and things to kind of help make these things work really well. But it's been a really interesting kind of learning experience to go, okay, like, what are the operational processes we need? What are the technical technology solutions we need? What does the customer experience we want to build look like? And how do we integrate all that together so that it kind of turns into a really integrated, seamless experience for you as a consumer? And also, the other side of this tension is, how do we also take workload off frontline GPs and nurses so they can focus on the people that are in front of them, not having to deal with this backlog of administrative work that they all have to deal with every day, and by moving that into a team that can kind of process that more efficiently.
There's a lot going on there.
There is a lot going on there.
Yeah, I'd love to delve in a bit more, but we're running out of time. I think folks will be very interested to have a look at the app and so on. Your coverage at the moment in terms of physical presence?
Yeah. So we have 2 Tend-branded medical centres in central Auckland, so one on Simon Street and then one in Kingsland. We've got another medical centre that we own in Pakuranga that will be rebranding as a Tend medical centre next year. And then we've just announced this partnership with Better Health in the South Island, so that's still very nascent, but we'll be planning to expand services nationwide. But obviously the physical infrastructure needs to come, like, it'd be very easy for us to launch the app nationwide right now, but we don't think that's the right thing to do for patients. We don't think it's the right thing to do for the system. It needs to be supported by local providers that are integrated into that whole kind of service model. And there are other companies in the market that make apps that you can use for your own practice if you have one, but we have the kind of vertically integrated approach where we have centralized operations for a whole bunch of stuff that mean that we can kind of deliver these services in a way that's predictable. I think, there's a long history in this country of trying to launch apps without kind of really having the supporting operational infrastructure and the customer experience and stuff around that to make that all work. And it's led to a little bit of almost PTSD from the health sector, to be honest, of going, oh, apps don't work, which is something I hear quite a lot. We relaunched Simon Street at the end of last year. So prior to that, they had no app. It was just a normal medical centre with a phone and a fax. They don't have a fax anymore, which is I consider a win. And all the phones are essentially managed at Tend, so the phones don't actually ring in the medical centres anymore. They ring into a central customer service team that can then deal with you, which is great. But we launched our app there in December, so no users of the app. And by kind of March or April, we had more than 90% of patient interactions in a month happening on the app. because we've just put a lot of effort into designing a really streamlined customer experience, which is exactly the same as what you see signing up for Instagram. But it's not something, I don't think that health has necessarily appreciated the kind of product design ethos that is kind of quite prevalent across the tech ecosystem. And so it's kind of really putting the effort into like, how do we really streamline this stuff? So I think on average it's taking around 2.5 minutes for a user to sign up to Tend, which is, pretty good. About 80% of people that finish that process, which is an amazing conversion rate. In almost any kind of environment I've ever worked in, it's unheard of. So just really kind of polishing. How do we get the right information from people as progressively as possible, as simply as possible to kind of make things happen? Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, we'll definitely have to get you back for for an update along the way. But yeah, really interesting to get some insights and hear a bit about your journey, Josh. So yeah, thanks for sharing all your or some of your expertise and experiences with us. Really appreciated that. Thanks everyone for listening in. Also, a huge thank you to our show partners, Vodafone, Spark, 2 Degrees, HP, Gorilla Technology, and Deal. We really appreciate their support for keeping us on the air. And thanks everyone. We'll be back again next week with another episode. There's a fair bit more content sort of coming through between now and Christmas, and we'll probably also have some things to listen into during the break as well if you're so inclined.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks again, Josh.
Thank you.
Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.